Please welcome Marianna Boncek.
Thank you. I used to work for the Time and Valleys Museum as a museum educator. And when I was working, that was when I decided to come and do the talk about the takings. So even though I don't work there anymore, I still have a close relationship with them. And the Time and the Valleys Museum is the only museum that is dedicated to the local taking of the land of the reservoir. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the takings, and then I'll do a little commercial about the museum itself. So I want to use this. So the takings refer, when people say the takings, it's in the entire process of eminent domain, where New York City took homes, lands, farms, businesses, anything that was in the way to build the reservoirs. So it was a whole process of eminent domain and then condemnation. And so that is what I'm focusing on tonight. So I'm going to backtrack a little here. So in 1623, I'm sure most of you know this history, 31 Dutch colonists and their families arrived here in New York City. They called it New Amsterdam, and then it was later changed to New York. At that time, because I love these two pictures, at that time there was clearly enough water for everybody who was there because there weren't very many people. And Eric Sanderson, who wrote a history of New York, said that it had vast forests of timber where there were otter, beavers, mink, oyster, brook trout, and bears. So it was this really vast wilderness. So to get an idea, so I just looked at the census for every 10 years, and you already see by 1790 there are 33,000 New Yorkers. And what I'm saying, this isn't New York staters. These are the people who are living there on Manhattan and the surrounding area. So these years that I have bolded are reservoir years, when reservoirs were built in that decade. So by 1840, the first reservoir was built. And you can see, as the population goes up quickly, the number of reservoirs that need to be built also go up quickly. In 1870, there are 2 being built. By the time they reach 1 million people, they built 5 reservoirs in the 1890s, 3 from 19 to 1910, 4 from 1910 to 1920, and then 1 in the 1920s. And we don't see reservoirs again until 1950 and 1960. And it's kind of weird. So you can see, when we've got, the strong immigration happening, they were just basically running out of water. So that is the New York City area. So, of course, now, this is the last census data that I was able to get. The New York City area has 8,804,190 people. I love how they do it right down to the number. So it's almost 9 million people. And the population of the metro area, that's, like New Jersey, Connecticut, the surrounding areas, is almost 20 million people. The average New Yorker today consumes between 100 and 125 gallons of water every day. And that includes, taking a bath, watering lawns, flushing toilets. So that is the need. The average household in New York City uses 100,000 gallons of water in 1 year. So that's the average. So clearly there's a big need for water. I call this stating the obvious. But as you know, Manhattan is an island surrounded by salt water. So the only water originally available was rainwater, groundwater, and collect pond, which I'll talk about. But this was abundant water, in the 16 and early 1700s. There really wasn't much problem. If you're from New York City, You may know where Collect Pond Park is. This was Collect Pond. If you're from the city, it was 130 Leonard Street is where this pond used to be. And as you can see, the farms around it. And I do have a map. I don't know. So Collect Pond is that red dot in the middle where Collect Pond would have been. So there is a park there, Collect Pond Park. There still is a spring there, which creates problems for the surrounding buildings because the water, fills the ground and makes it unstable there. So there still is a spring that is there at Collect Pond, which is kind of cool.
Where's the spring fed from?
It's underground, so it's from underground water. Because even though it's an island, the underground water of Manhattan is fresh water. So the spring would come up from the underground water and feed that.
What's the source of the underground water from the spring?
Yeah, it's just a spring. It feeds from the underground water table, yeah. So, but the area where Collect Pond was, as people moved to New York, factories started to be built there. African Americans made that free to African Americans, so poor people lived there, and the pond became their, dumpster. And so, and which kind of is like by 1808, the water was so polluted, the pond had to be filled in. So your only big source of water is gone. Still wasn't too much of a problem. They still used wells. It wasn't as clean as maybe our water. But when it became clearly obvious that they had run out of water is the Great Fire of 1835. Now, there are several great fires in New York City, but this one, they did not have enough water to put the fire out. They definitely had enough manpower to put the fire out. It burned 17 city blocks. It killed 2 people. And one of the problems is it was on December 16th, so water was frozen. They weren't able to access it. So it was this huge, and I've got a little, so that's the area that was burned by this fire. And there were 1,500 firemen alone who fought this fire. Again, it wasn't the lack of manpower, it was the lack of water. They actually tried to set some of the fire, buildings around it on fire with hope that burning those buildings down, the fire wouldn't jump. So this was kind of like the great awakening, like, oh, we don't have enough water in the city. So
Right there at the East River.
yes,
So the East River was,
frozen.
they couldn't chop through the ice.
They couldn't chop it fast enough. And of course, they didn't have the mechanical they had pumps, but they were all hand pumps to pump the water, and they just couldn't pump, not just the amount of water, but the pressure you would need to put the fire out. Because we've got the fire now pretty much, it's raging, so a trickle of water is not going to put the fire out. Yeah. So that was the moment that it said, wow, we need water. The Croton Reservoir was the first reservoir. The city realized that any clean water had to come from not on the island. It had to come from off the island. So they chose the Croton watershed, which I do have a picture on that. So the Croton watershed you see is down here. This is our watershed up here, the Catskill, Delaware, and that's the Croton watershed. A watershed is just an area where water deposits underneath the earth. So there's a large deposit of water. It's kind of like mining. A watershed is kind of like a mine, but for water. So the people there who lived in that area were characterized as farmers who scratched out their existence, and the city suggested by taking their land, they were actually doing them a favor. We're going to give them this money. They're going to be able to go do something meaningful with their lives.
I don't want to interrupt, but how do they determine where a watershed is back then?
Pretty much by the geography, and so I have some pictures showing like how you can actually I mean, we have drones now, so we can see from above, like where water would feed, where water would collect. So they were able to tell that that water collected there. And plus it's down, where it would feed into the ocean. So, Westchester, Putnam, and Dutchess counties, as well as Fairfield County, Connecticut, were all in this watershed area. So the new Croton, because there was the old Croton, the new Croton Reservoir is located solely in Westchester County. But it stretches through the towns of Cortland, Yorktown, Somers, Bedford, and Newcastle. The current reservoir is 22 miles from New York City, and it was used by damming the Croton River and the old and in Yorktown. So the old dam was built between 1837 and 1842. And I'm not really going to talk about the Croton, but it's good to know that how they came up here.
Marianna?
Yes.
I would just make the point, the second chief engineer of the D&H Canal, John Jervis, was the engineer for the original Croton.
Well, I'm not surprised because, that's kind of something I wanted to mention, that the reservoirs were amazing engineering feats. And these engineers, were coming to do all these, D&H Canal, great feat. And I think that's a lot of time how they learned how to build other things. So the Croton system was outgrowing itself as fast as they could build reservoirs. So they build a reservoir, put it into function, and it will already not be enough. The Croton system ended up having 13 reservoirs. And I'll always mention Kensico Reservoir because Kensico Reservoir draws water from both the Croton and the Catskill watersheds. It is the only reservoir that draws from both. So when I say there's 13 reservoirs and you count and you're like, but wait, there's really 4. No, it's not. So the Kensico counts twice. So the 13 reservoirs have about a 91.6 billion gallons of water capacity, and the current Croton system only provides 10% of New York City's drinking water at this time because it's so small.
Does it go to a particular location in New York City?
They pretty much all go to the same areas. They're all gravity fed. And that is one thing that I am not an expert on, but it's an amazing system, the way that they bring it in. Croton has to be brought in and not mixed with the Catskill water because it does need to be treated where Catskill water doesn't need to be treated. So, and I think that it is more expensive to run the Croton system that provides only 10% of the water than it does to run the whole Catskill Delaware system. So that's why they want our water.
Why does their water need to be treated?
Because of the area it is, it's not as clean, and it doesn't have the same restrictions that we have in this area. So New York City was running, of course, they started to look north. And I grabbed this picture, it's not mine, but I grabbed it because, somebody asked, how do you know? You can just see the river running in the valley bottom, and there's a big space in there, and you've got these mountains that are probably got rock. That would be a great place to dam it up and put a lake in there. Isn't that gorgeous? Let's just yes,
Yeah.
yes, let's just, So these, I don't list all the reservoirs. These are the ones in our area. So the years they first went into service and the volume in billions. When I say Shokan was built, in 1915 and can hold 122.9 billion, that is at its highest level. It does not mean that it runs a constant 122 billion gallons. If you've driven by the reservoirs, you'll notice they go up and down. So that is at its max capacity. It can hold 122 billion gallons. They also can't drain a reservoir. So it's not like, we need more, let's just drain this one. And yeah, so they have to maintain it. I'm not sure what those levels are. They do have to maintain basic levels in all the reservoirs. The Kensico, that's the one that's like in both systems, 30 billion. You can see Schoharie is 17, the Roundout. I grew up between the Roundout and the Neversink. The Roundout holds 49.6, Neversink 34.9, Pipacton 140. and Cannonsville 95.7. So the Shokan Reservoir is the largest reservoir as far as surface water. So that's why if you're ever flying over the area and you look down, you can see the Shokan Reservoir very clearly because it's so large. So this is actually, the Time in the Valleys Museum is getting a wagon like this. This is the building of the Shokan Reservoir, and you can see the mules here, and you can see the wagons. And one of the reasons I like to show this is the difference in technology from the very first building of the reservoir. You know, we're building the Shokan Reservoir with picks and shovels and donkeys, and then by the time we're building the Rondout Reservoir, there's backhoes and all the kind of technology that is developed. But that is the building of the Shokan Reservoir. Jumping ahead. So how did, this was always the question that I got asked at the museum. Well, how did the city get all that land? They asked nicely and they got it. No, that's not how they got it. By 1902 to 1905, New York City knew where they wanted to build the Shokan Reservoir. They were sending out surveyors. They were not telling the local people. They were sending out surveyors. So they wanted to have a real solid plan in place before they started to let the locals know. Now, it's sometimes when we talk about the locals versus the city, I want to acknowledge that people needed water. I mean, there was no other place to get it. And that we are now the stewards of that water that people drink. But there was really a painful process that people had to go through so other people could have safe drinking water. So eminent domain, if you've never heard the term, it refers to the power of the government to take private property and convert it into public use. So what New York City did is they surveyed all the lands that they wanted the reservoir on. They decided, literally they got the maps and whose lands are we going to take. And then they basically told them, we are going to condemn your land. There was a court process which they went through. So the eminent domain was the taking of the land, and then the land was condemned. Just like, anything that's like, house is broken down, it gets condemned. You can no longer live in it, and you have to leave. There were no choices. There were no decisions. It was just if your house was taken, it was taken. There's no court procedure you could go through to save your house or anything like that. And that's where I think some of the problems started. So in 1905, a New York State public health law allowed New York City to acquire land through the use of eminent domain to establish a water system. The law didn't say in the Catskills, it just said, we now give New York City permission to go beyond their borders to get land. So then in 1906, this was the important part, the state legislature passed an amendment offering 1/2 of the assessed value of land to the landowners. So think what your house is assessed and cut that in half, and that's what you were going to get. In 1915, and this is where people start getting a little itchy, is that the city secured permission to enforce health and cleanliness standards. So not only did they take land, but they could now tell you how to use your private land that you got to keep. So there were new restrictions on farmers, new restrictions on where you could build property, new restrictions on where you could have a well or a septic tank. And again, there was not, you couldn't say, well, that's not working for me. You just had to do it. So that's where I think a lot of the problems started to crop up. So, and we know this. I mean, we know that laws have become stricter from 1907 to now. The federal, state, and city laws have become more comprehensive and allow for more oversight as people are concerned about their drinking waters. I mean, I'm sure you're concerned about drinking water in your community. So these laws actually protect all of us. Land restrictions were imposed particularly on people living in the watershed.
Did they get water from these reservoirs themselves?
No. There is no local water from the reservoir. The reservoirs and the land that the city take are all 100% owned by New York City, so they're private property. They are not, they pay taxes. New York City pays taxes on the land that they take, so they are private. You can kind of sit it as a giant private lake owned by New York City, so local people cannot take water. They also, until recently, did not allow recreation. They're still not, you can't take a motorboat or, ski-doo on these either. You can fish, but you have to get a New York City fishing license, not just a New York State one. So, and I grew up with the restrictions, so I just kind of, thought that every town has the same restrictions. But, for example, anybody building a house, your septic system has to be approved by New York City if you live in the area. Farmers can only graze animals so far, it has to be a certain distance from streams. So it gets to be a little, you can't tell me what to do with my land kind of thing. But yes, they can. They have the laws behind them that they can. So in the 1990s, because New York City was literally taking so much land, they were barred by taking land by eminent domain anymore. And I actually remember when the plan came out. I lived in the village of Grahamsville. You don't have to be familiar to know that there was a stream, and then there is the main road. And there are houses between the stream and the main road. And New York City's plan was to eminent domain all the houses and businesses between the main road and the stream. So we would have lost half our village. It was the same plan with Boyceville. They were going to eminent domain all the lands on the side where the grocery store is, not the side where the school is. And people just said, enough. So they actually took the city to court, and the city said you can take the lands, but you have to purchase them and you cannot eminent domain them. So you can't just go in and say, I'm going to take your house. You now have to wait until the house comes up for sale or the person buys it. So in 1990s, no more eminent domain. And in 2014, the New York City did the flood buyout program. And that way they put aside money to buy homes, buildings, businesses that are in flood-prone areas, because flooding creates pollution. I have seen that in the town of Grahamsville, because I think I said to you that I'm slowly seeing the city buying up villages. So in the town of Grahamsville, where I grew up, right in the middle, there used to be a series of 5 houses there that are no longer there, and they went slowly. One was bought, and then maybe a few years later, the next one was bought, and actually just 2 years ago. So they buy the houses, so the town is disappearing. So, and they also are buying houses above leaking aqueducts. So if the aqueduct that carries the water under the ground starts to leak, instead of repairing the aqueduct, they are buying the house and tearing it down. And so there are some towns that are a little nervous that they're about to lose their villages, but slowly.
Happened in Wawarsing, right?
Yes, Wawarsing, very much so in Wawarsing. It is cheaper for New York City to purchase homes that have the aqueducts leaking on their property than to fix the aqueduct. So they just buy them and tear them down. And though I don't have a slide on here, this is like the really awful thing. So they buy a piece of land and they tear the house down. And you're thinking, well, what do they got this property in the middle of town. What would they do with it? They put a sign on it that it can be used for recreational use with permit. So if you want to use this little piece of property, you have to go get a permit to have a picnic on it. But they don't maintain these properties, so they become overgrown. So you drive around and look for those signs. You'll see that there are signs that you can use this property recreationally if you get a permit. And then you're like, well, where would I park my car? And what would we do there anyway?
But don't they have to fix the aqueduct eventually?
They do not plan to fix the aqueduct at this time. I think they're going to.
It's a big pipe, right?
Yes, a huge pipe. Yeah.
But it's going to leak to the neighbors.
and then they'll just buy the neighbor's house. That's their plan right now. I think eventually the aqueduct system is going to collapse and they're not going to have a choice. But at this time, they're just purchasing properties.
How many gallons a day does that aqueduct leak?
They haven't said, but it is in the millions, I've read.
Millions a day?
Yeah.
Gallons a day?
Yes. So what leaves here and what makes it to the city are two different numbers.
Do they sell the houses?
No, they tear them down and the land remains,
Why won't they fix the aqueduct?
because it's so expensive. I have a picture of it's a gigantic engineering feat. And it also runs under, it's not like a ditch that runs alongside a road. It runs under homes and businesses and towns. So to get down in there, it's a huge task. I mean, it was at the time of the original building, and this area wasn't as built up as it was. The aqueduct in Shokan is actually above ground. I can't remember I think it's 213, and you can actually follow so you can see how big they are and how far they are.
No, I know they're enormous, but
Yeah.
you would think that they could shut the water at their source.
They can't ever shut the water down. They can't shut the water down.
That's true. They are shutting the Delaware water down in October.
But they can't ever shut the major aqueduct into New York City down. They would have to build an alternate aqueduct. And the one that runs from Roundout to New York City is the longest underground aqueduct in the world. It's all gravity fed. There's no motors or anything. And if it shut down, what would...
For 8 months, the Delaware aqueduct will be closed starting in October.
Aren't they glad that it's been raining and the other reservoirs have enough water? Or that could be quite a problem.
Couldn't that be a big environmental lawsuit about losing millions of gallons of water?
It is. I read it in the paper all the time, but, and also, I don't even remember when the meters came in. Growing up, New York City did not pay for their water. I paid for my water when I lived in Port Ewan, but people who lived in Manhattan did not pay for that water, and that is a new thing. So maybe with the money, they'll, fix some things. So this is really what I wanted to talk about, is what they took. So this is actually, this is one of the mills there that they took. But the attitude here, and it was even actually printed in the paper, that just like when they took Croton, nobody lived here. So they weren't really taking anything, it was all barren, virgin land. So what was the problem? So this is actually Bishop Falls. So Olive Bridge, I can't remember exactly which one it was in. So it wasn't barren, virgin land. And actually that attitude persists to this day. I actually was watching a video on the computer, and the woman vacations in the Catskills. And she says, but in the winter, nobody lives there and it's abandoned. I'm like, I live there. So that is a persistent fallacy. That it's okay. Oh, so we took a couple of houses. It's not that big of a deal, right?
I mean, I also asked, I would think this leaking water is going to develop sinkholes.
I think it actually makes the ground spongier. So sinkholes are made when the water dries out. So these are, and actually there's a place in Wawarsing that you walk, it feels very swampy, when you walk on it, because it leaks water. So New York City, by eminent domain, took the best land near the water sources. So every, place they took was because a river ran through it. In many cases, a very large river. On the valley bottom, where the best farming was possible. Residents were often forced to relocate to poor land, unsuitable for farming, and far from an adequate water source. So they moved up the mountain. Well, you go up the mountain, there's not as much water as there was when you were down by the stream or the river. So they were needed to, once they received the notice of condemnation, it was usually 30 days you had to leave your house, but it could be as few as 10 days, especially if they were expecting to start work on where you were.
It's
What
19
years?
This is, yeah, that one is dated 1937. But in the Shokan, they started condemning houses as early as 1907. And so you could be told you got to get out of here in 10 days. Now, the horror, then it gets like worse. It gets worse. So because the houses needed to be burned, they would pay you extra if you burned your own house to the ground. It's like, I can't even imagine, like, first we have to leave in 10 days and then you want us to burn it down. So, yes. And these were actually taxed to houses and barns once the condemnation was completed. So residents were compensated for property only. They were not compensated for business or business income. So if you had a farm, you were compensated for the farm buildings. You weren't compensated for your farm animals or your farm machinery. So once that condemnation went up on your building, most people had about 30 days to leave. So what if everybody in your neighborhood who are all farmers read the condemnation at the same time and you need to sell your cows? Well, you can't sell your cows. Everybody's selling cows. So people a lot of times just gave their animals away, abandoned their farm machinery because they couldn't sell it. So this also goes for boarding houses. If you owned a boarding house, you were given the money for the house itself, but not for the business. General store, business, not the stuff inside.
So there were some lawsuits that people brought against the city to get better compensation, right?
Yes, and those dragged on for years. The last one, the Roundout Reservoir was finished in 1954, and the last one was settled in 1998. So when I say they dragged on for years, yes, for generations.
And some houses were moved that people.
Some houses were moved, but once your house was condemned, the city owned it. If you wanted your house, you had to buy it back. Yeah, and then you were responsible for moving it. You had to pay for it to be moved. So, yeah. And yes, you know, I didn't put that in a slide, but yes, there were people who committed suicide because it was just so horrific. I mean, there were farmers, particularly in the Shokan area, who'd been here for generations already, and that was a generational property. And
Any notification that this is coming?
there wasn't any notification until they started the eminent domain, and by the time they had that, they already had the maps of what they were going to take, so they knew. So it was rather quick after that. So people didn't have a lot of time to prepare, like, oh my gosh, they're taking our house, and 30 days later you got to get out. So it was, and many times, that fast. And I think they depended on the shock value to people to be so shocked they couldn't organize and figure out how we're going to stop this, which they wouldn't have been able to anyway.
Was the eminent domain done by the state of New York or the city of New York?
The city was given the power by the
This was
state.
Tammany Hall. This was
Yes.
the Democratic Party, Tammany Hall.
But the state had passed a law to allow them to do that. Without that law, they would have been able to take lands, but only New York City lands. They wouldn't have been able to take non-New York City lands. So that law shifted it so that they could take the lands they wanted.
But this was like in the 1930s. This was like Fiorello LaGuardia. This was LaGuardia.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, a lot of the plans were done in New York City, no consultation with any local people. So by the time the lands were being taken, this process had been in work for years, if not even like a decade. I'm sure they know which lands they're taking next. I'm sure they know. They're not going to tell people, though, until it's time to take them. So, and for the Shokan Reservoir, there were 7 communities there. Number of people that were relocated was 2,000, and the numbers of bodies reburied from local cemeteries were 2,800, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So these are the number of towns that were taken or relocated, the number of people that were moved, and then the number of cemeteries that they dug up the people and reburied them elsewhere. The reason why Neversink and Cannonsville don't have any reburying is they claimed that there were no cemeteries in those reservoirs.
Oh,
I grew up there. Sometimes grandma and grandpa, and you drive by here, are buried in the backyard. Like, it's not a formal cemetery. So I know, and Neversink Cemetery is one of the main ones, was just off where the reservoir was. So
I grew up in rural Wisconsin, and partly in rural Wisconsin, and every farm had a
Yeah.
cemetery on the back 40.
Yeah.
Every farm had with at least 10 or 12 graves of longtime farmers on
Yeah.
there.
So,
Every farm.
you
We used to go and visit them.
yeah, especially if the family left. There's no one there to say, hey, there's 5 people up here on the hill. So when they dug them up, they dug the cemetery up, if they knew the family, like if they could locate the family, they would ask, where do you want the remains to be moved to? And they would remove the remains and the stone to that cemetery. The bodies were not interred in coffins. They were interred in boxes that were about this big. And they just put the remains in those boxes and sealed those boxes. So they weren't put in coffins. And the Shokin Reservoir, not only if you burn down your house, you get some money. If you dig up your own dead, they would give you some money as well. So,
Did they give you 30 days?
yes, you had to be fast. Go get grandma and the kids off the hill, because we gotta. So, yeah. So this is the relocated people from Shokan. Some of you maybe have been to this cemetery.
Oh, that's along 54.
I want to say it's.
Pine Bush? Isn't it Pine
No, this one is up in
Moon Hall?
Moon Hall Road, off Moon Hall. Yes. So, and people are like, why could they be so close together? Because the box is literally only this big of the person being relocated.
Is it cardboard box?
It's a wooden box, and then nailed together. So it's a very small box. Now, of course, they had done Cannonsville, but this was the first time they were up here. So Shokan was the first time they were digging up bodies, and they didn't do a very good job of identifying them, because you can see that this tombstone reads OB 17. So that means the 17th person disinterred from Olive Bridge. Doesn't even have their name. And for a long time, no one could find the corresponding, like, who was number 17. And just recently, I've seen an author has found some of the information and has been able to identify some of the people now buried there. But that's why it's like, if I can go back to that, when you look at that, there are no names there. It's just, that's where they are. It's kind of sad. Now, I don't have pictures of the unclaimed from the Rondout Reservoir, but you'll know where this is. If you go to Stone Ridge, the elementary school, across from the elementary school, is a very little cemetery. It has no parking. That is where the unclaimed from the Rondout Reservoir were reinterred. And the unclaimed from the Grahamsville Reservoir were actually put in the Grahamsville Cemetery, because at that time it was a really huge rural cemetery. But they were put as far back as you could get without falling into the river. So that's where they are. Any questions before I go on to some of the towns that were moved? Yeah. I went to, I was in the Lackawanna Cemetery, and where they moved some of the people who, they wanted their families' remains. And to see, like, these graves of children, it, like, pulls at your little heartstring there. So like I said, I grew up between the Neversink and the Rondout Reservoirs. They were both about a mile from my home. So this is, and now I apologize that these aren't very clear, but these are old pictures, so they're not going to be very clear. This is Neversink Flats, and I like this picture because it becomes immediately clear why you want to put a reservoir here. Like, look at that. Like, you can see, like, I can see the reservoir without the water, So this is where Neversink Flats is now. This is the dam. And that would have been where the village was. So this is where they stopped, dammed the water. So that's Neversink's Flats today. So this is Neversink. So, Neversink Flats and Neversink were, little villages of the same town. So that was the town of Neversink. And like I said, there aren't a lot of pictures, because photography wasn't this huge thing. There are more postcards. So this is Neversink on the banks of the Neversink River, because they have to dam a river. So that was the Neversink River that they dammed. So I'd like to look at these pictures, because that idea that nobody lived there is this kind of busts that, right? It might not have been a huge town, but there were businesses and churches and schools and all those kind of things. People lived there. This is Bittersweet, New York, which is a house in Bittersweet. Bittersweet was also part of Neversink. Neversink was actually relocated. So if there were churches or if you had a business, they offered you land up the hill. So there is a Neversink today. It's not that Neversink. Towns like Bittersweet were so small that they weren't relocated. They were just, they just got rid of them. So Bittersweet had a schoolhouse. It had a post office. It wasn't very large, but there is no more Bittersweet, New York. So Neversink, New York, yes.
Was a criteria maybe that it didn't have electricity?
No, because I grew up there and a lot of places didn't have electricity until the 1970s. So it is rural, but, there were people obviously working there. This is also Bittersweet. Now the Rondout Reservoir is not very far from the Neversink Reservoir. And you can see, where the road went, right? Where the people lived, right there, you can see it. This is the dam, and you can see the valley they dammed up. Mm-hmm. So that road on the right, you can just see a road, would have been more center. I think I threw this in the wrong place. And again, because they're so old and they're hard to blow up, this is actually building the tunnel that will take the water from the Rondout Reservoir to New York City.
And what supplied the reservoir? Just the river?
The Rondout Reservoir. I mean, the Rondout
River.
River, yeah.
And the river was supplied by what? Mountain runoff?
Yeah, pretty much. And that's what when we talk the watershed area, all the water from that area. So springs, ponds, rivers, creeks fill that area. So they all eventually, yes.
Underwater artesian springs, underwater springs?
Yep, everything.
Is it also true that the Rondout is a receiver for the Cannonsville?
Yes.
Carpathian water, so it's an interim reservoir for the further runs?
And I'm not sure if I have a picture, but you can actually see the flow, how they go from one reservoir to another. The Rondout Reservoir is, like you said, it's the receiver reservoir, and it's sometimes quite dangerous. I mean, that was one thing growing up that parents could not get into. Their kids had enough. You never, ever, ever swim in the Rondout, because the levels can fluctuate in minutes. And I've been in the area when all of a sudden you've got this little tiny creek turn into this raging river like that, because they've opened a gate to. Other reservoirs don't necessarily have those, but since the Rondout, if you go to the Rondout, it often looks why doesn't it have a lot of water? Because they don't need to send water there yet. So it's very swampy on one end of the Rondout. And this is, I just, see how small the men are. I know it didn't blow up well, but these are huge, 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 huge tunnels. They plan to use, I hope my figures are right, they plan to lose, because it was so dangerous, 1 man for every 25 miles they built of this, because it was so dangerous to be working underground. So anyway, back to the Rondout. Those were the building of the Rondout. You can see this is a map of Lackawanna. Lackawanna was actually moved up the hill. And here is, again, they don't blow up very well, but this was Main Street, Lackawanna. Lackawanna, Eureka, and Montilla in the Rondout were summertime tourist destinations. So they had rather big buildings. This was a huge resort. in Lackawanna. And greetings. It was a big thing, especially in Lackawanna, for people to come up from the city and have a farm experience. Like, oh, I go up, I'm gonna, have a farm experience. This is Montilla, which is just like a mile or two from Lackawanna, and that is their main street. And Eureka is very small, so I have very, very, very few pictures from Eureka. But Eureka did have a post office, it had a gas station. I do believe that that building there was relocated. I think I even know where it is. This is Eureka. And again, I took this one because you can see right behind this house, like exactly how you would flood that. It just is just a beautiful, beautiful place to make a reservoir.
Did they flood? Did they just flood it, or did they dig things out first?
They did. They got rid of all the buildings. They cut down all the trees, and they built the dam. And then it naturally flooded itself. So like it took quite a while for the reservoirs to fill. They didn't, they didn't, like we just build the dam and 3 months later it's filled. It took years for some of them to full, unless they got fed into by another reservoir. So I originally wasn't going to talk about the Shokan Reservoir, but I figure most of you are probably from here. So I threw in a few slides. So the Shokan Reservoir took land from 11 towns, and it created the 8,300 acre strip of land for the reservoir. So Brown Station, Olive City, and Broadhead Bridge were not relocated. So there is no Brown Station, New York anymore. It no longer exists. But West Hurley, Shokan, and West Shokan were located. So that's why those are still towns. Lands were also taken from the town of Woodstock, Hurley, and Olive. That's Brown Station. I love that picture. Just love that. Yeah, it's in Woodstock now. Yeah. So, and I know that these are really underestimated. The reservoir took 504 private homes, 35 stores, 10 churches, 10 schools, 9 blacksmith shops, 7 sawmills, and a grist mill.
That's the Ashoka.
Yes. But you know what's not there? The schools. And, so 504 homes, but like even nowadays, you have a home, but grandma lives there, those kind of things. So this McClellan Act also allowed the reservoir to take the Ulster Delaware Railroad and parts of the State Forest Preserve.
I just want to say that Fiorello LaGuardia, who's considered this great progressive and man of the people, he was mayor of New York from 34 to 46. And that's the real time that this land was being grabbed.
That's the problem, the ruthless. We do have to think about people needed water. I mean, where were they going to get it? But it's the ruthlessness, I think, that bothers everybody. Yeah. So this is just absolutely floored me, particularly when I started working for the museum. The New York Department of Environmental Protection kept extensive records on the building of the reservoirs. And when I say extensive, anything you want to know, even if it's painful information, they have it. There was nothing that they did not record. And going through their records is extremely, and they don't necessarily keep them in any sort of order, and they're not all digitized. But I think there was a sense they were very proud of what they were doing, because this was these reservoirs are an amazing, amazing feat of engineering. The Catskill Delaware water system is the cleanest water in the world. It does not need to be treated when it arrives in New York. It is filtered because, there's, as we joke, the fish poop in it. But it is not treated in any way like even Kingston's water is treated. It is it's called the champagne of, of the world. Because, and I think they were extremely proud of this. And they should be. I mean, they did this amazing engineering feat. They came up with some of the cleanest water in the world. But at the same time, the amount of, and people say, well, 2,000 people in Shokan, what does that matter when there are 9 million? And you think,
Ask where are their archives? Where they keep them?
They do have an office in New York City. They're not super always forthcoming with sharing them with you, but you can do FOIL requests. I had, for the museum, did some FOIL requests. There also, you'll see the DEP police. Those are also, they're here to protect the lands and the New York City's interest. They do, as I said, the lands are private and they do pay taxes. They pay school taxes, they pay town taxes. The issue that most local people have with the taxes that they pay, which is in the millions and millions of dollars, is that they are taxed for undeveloped land. Whereas if there were houses or development, they would pay more tax. And the continuing argument is it was developed land. And if you did tax the land as if it was lakefront, it would also, pay more in taxes. But I know, my dad lived less than a mile from the reservoir. His taxes were so low, it was pretty ridiculous.
What about microplastics in water now?
I think because they have such, they have really strict regulations that we're not seeing that in the reservoirs as much as you're seeing it in other places. Plus, we don't have industry here in the Catskill, Delaware. And in a way, they make sure that we don't get the industries that would pollute the water. I mean, there's really, if you're going to open a business near any sort of, and I mean any sort of water source, a spring, a stream, there are very strict restrictions. There are some benefits, like my brother's house was flooded and he lost his septic system, and New York City paid for him to put in a very efficient septic system so it would never flood again. He didn't pay a dime for that, but they really want to make sure that there's nothing going in there. I think that's it, unless you have questions. Oh, I wanted to talk about the museum very briefly. So this is the Time in the Valleys Museum. That was my office window right there. I really loved working there, but it just didn't work out. But it is the only museum that is dedicated solely to the taking of the land. And it's small, but it's an extremely professional building. It's truly in the middle of nowhere, but that's fine. So they talk a lot about the people who sacrificed their lands. They have archives. They have done interviews. So they're trying to preserve the history. So it started in 2003 when people realized the old timers are dying and we're losing this history. So they got together and they formed this a board and they built this museum. It opened in 2011. It is a 3-story museum. It's quite lovely. And it is attached to the Daniel Pierce Library. Now, what I think is really cool is in 2018, they opened what is called the Lost Catskill Farm. People started to donate buildings to the museum. And so what they did with those buildings is they created a farm that is condemned. And you can actually go out, and there's a house, there's a barn, there's an outhouse, there's a chicken house, and they continue to get more buildings. It is decorated historically accurate. It holds things that you would find in a 1930s farmhouse. And the absolute coolest thing for me is it has an electric generating station that you could have bought in the 1930s from Sears, and you could have generated your own electricity. And I'm like, I want one of those now. I want to generate my own electricity so I don't have to pay for it, It has an in-house post office, which I remember them, growing up there. The front of the house has you go in the living room and there's a post office. And they do also have the condemnation signs up on the house. So this currently, so if you go to the museum, the first is it the first floor? No, it's the middle floor, is the water in the valleys, and it's the local history. And it actually starts with the Native Americans and moves right up to the condemnations. The tunnels, toil, and trouble, which is the bottom floor, is totally dedicated to the building of the reservoirs. So if you have engineer questions or any of that, it can be answered there. Then there's a revolving display on the top floor, and it is currently Bittersweet Memories. They did this really cool thing where local artists got pictures of buildings that had been under they were condemned, and they painted them. And not only did that, after they were done painting them, they gave the pictures to students at the local community college who animated them. So if you have your smartphone, you can hold your phone up and the picture will actually be animated, and you can see how perhaps they used to live. And the Lost Catskill Farm is interactive. You can go in all the buildings. You can have lots of fun. Like I said, and it's really cheap. It's only $5. It is open only Saturday and Sundays. And all these places say by appointment only. They really mean if you can only come up on a Wednesday afternoon, give them a call. They'll open up and let you come and see it. They do have tremendous amount of records. If you have family who had land there, they can help you find where it was located and those kind of things.
Do you get a lot of school groups?
They do, but here's the problem. That was my job. That's what I did. No, the school groups came during the week. If you have ever been to Grahamsville, I don't think many of them have, it is truly in the middle of nowhere. So it's going to take you a while to get there. And when you get there, don't expect to go and get something to eat. Like, it is really, so a lot of people get there, like, I actually gave a talk there, and one of my friends came and said, where the heck, where am I? So it's funny, I was interviewed in a magazine, and they called Grahamsville the outback of Sullivan County. So it's really, yes, it's really out there. But most people who get there are like amazed at the history. So I recommend taking a Saturday, driving up there. The people who are there, many of them, their families, the houses were condemned in the reservoir and can talk to you with personal experience. So, any questions?
Marianna
Oh,
Boncek.
Thank you. I left these here. Those are about the museum. I put those over there if you want to take a flyer. Yes.
Woodstock, I know, gets their water from Cooper Lake.
Which is a reservoir, yeah.
Which is a reservoir, yeah. And then how good is that water compared to Ashokan and so forth?
Well, the reservoirs are considered cleaner because they actually have people to police that. So Cooper Lake is clean, but there's nobody who polices the water that go into that. So, we police it, by trying to keep our own stuff clean. So I'm not saying, because actually people have said Woodstock is like some of the best water there is, but the reason that the reservoirs are so clean is they have a really huge network of people who police it. Just try to trespass. No, don't try. Definitely do not try. But I have known people who just, hey, I just want to go down and see the shore, and next thing, and they're like, how did they even know I was here? They do police it. They also drive around to farms, make sure their runoff is not, so Cooper Lake doesn't have that structure to make sure. The reservoirs, of course, they're not going to have beavers. They're not going to have those kind of things because they do have that effort to make sure that those kind of pollution doesn't enter the reservoir system.
Well, last time I was at Ashokan, I saw deer and ducks, right? Ducks on the water, and also deer right at the end.
On the water, alive is fine, but building dams, they also try to clean out dead animals and those kind of things.
Now, what about Kingston? Where's the Kingston water come from?
Kingston water is actually from Cooper Lake, and they also have a reservoir on Sauk Hill.
They do, yeah.
Yeah, and Xena. There's one on Sauk Hill, one in Xena.
Okay.
Yeah. It's interesting. Ask where your town. When I lived in Port Ewan, it came from the Hudson. You could smell that. There were days that it's like, no, not today. Yeah.
Is it still the DEP that's primarily overseeing all of this? Is
Yes.
that the right word?
Yes.
Including the question about the pipelines.
Absolutely, yep. The department, it's called the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. That's what we get the DEP from. And it is not just, I mean, we tend to think of it as the police, you see them, but they're much more than police. They are, you can almost think of them as a corporation where they actually have a huge educational program for teachers, and they run workshops and camps. They have engineers. So think of it as like a really big corporation, but it's a government.
Yeah, I'm still flabbergasted that they're not paying any attention to the pipeline couple.
I would suggest doing a search because that's been a problem for like decades. That's like not a brand new problem. That has been a problem. When I was a child, the first 2 houses taken because of that were probably in the 1980s. So it's,
I have to say, Sophie, I'm on the town board, and they are working on fixing the pipe.
good. In what town?
Especially here in High Falls.
Okay, in High Falls.
The pressure tunnel is leaking, and probably about 2028 maybe, they'll be working on it, but they're progressing on it. Right.
But can you imagine how big it is? Like, even if they said, we are going to fix this, how long it would actually take, to get through. Well, Warsing is really bad. And the leaking in Warsing.
I'm working on Warsing first, that pipeline, and then they're gonna.
Good, so there.
So they are
Plant that
working
tree
on it,
now.
and they're very aware of the leakage, which is huge.
Have they taken any buildings here because of it?
No,
Well, that's good.
no.
The
Yeah.
pipeline is 600 feet below ground.
Yeah.
600 feet below ground?
This is not like, let's like close it off for a week and we'll fix it. And I know in Boyceville, like one of the contentious, they took a historic schoolhouse, they bought it. So, that becomes an issue, like how to fix things when there are, especially here, we're talking about history and so there's a balancing, like we need to fix this, but we also need to let these people have their community. Yes.
How far up the Esopus is the city empowered to determine what goes into the creek?
The entire thing.
Really?
Yeah.
All the way to the
Yes.
source?
Any water that feeds into the watershed system, any water, they have, the state legislator empowered them to do that.
Wow.
Control all the waterways in there.
Actually, New York City, and I know this is to do with our area, except for the beaver kill, New York City controls all the environmental in all the rivers in the watershed. I can't remember why it's not the beaver kill, but they do.
Wow.
First of all, thank you so much for your research and for this really amazing talk.
Absolutely.
I wanted to throw in something, which is that the West Coast company tried a couple of years ago to create a new reservoir in the Woodland Valley.
Oh,
You know
wow.
what stopped it? New York. Wrote a letter saying they had doubts about it or something.
Did they want the water for themselves?
Well, it would have come to them, it would have come to New York anyway, but they wouldn't have had total control maybe.
Yeah, and again,
I don't know what their reason was, but.
if we think of ourselves as the stewards of water for millions of people, we have something to be very proud of. We are keeping the water clean. But at the same time, the museum looks at what is the cost, and they don't mean money. They mean what is the cost. So.
One thing to be happy about is that the requirements of the city have dropped from 1.5 billion a day, gallons a day, to about 1 billion. So water conservation has created, a lot of excess capacity. And it's very fortunate because with the growth of population, we're able to keep up with it.
And that's the Department of Environmental Protection, as I said, they have an amazing educational program. I would often coordinate with them. I mean, from little kids, conserving water, all the way up to adults and teachers. They train science teachers. So, they aren't like the evil city. They do try to do things,
I have one more question about the labor history in your readings and research. Have you looked at any of the kind of nativist responses of American local workers to the influx of immigrants or brought off from Ellis Island immediately up here to start working on the reservoirs? I don't know if there were any such instances.
Oh my God, absolutely. There is this whole section in the museum that we talk about. So in the Shokin Reservoir, obviously groups were segregated. So you had the African Americans, you had the Irish, you had the Italians, and they all actually lived in their own little worker villages, but they record fights on Friday nights or Saturday nights, whatever. They work 6 days a week. But one of the controversies also was the locals who went to work to help build the dams, because you lost your house, you lost your farm. What were you going to do? So you went to work, or your sons went to work. So there was a lot of that sort of animosity as well. But the camps were huge, and there was all sorts of fighting all the time, because there wasn't anything for them to do. I mean, if they weren't working...
Shokan in Irish means peace. We used to call it Shokan.
Yeah, yeah. And there's actually, it's a big aside here, but there is several songbooks that the DEP created because the men could have something to do on their nights off. They would gather around and they would sing these songs about building the reservoir. Yeah.
An alternate reality is if you look at the Delaware Water Gap in the 60s, that's a big one.
That's a whole
There
new...
was, in the 60s, there was a plan to build a huge reservoir at the Delaware Water Gap, and they even started relocating people from there to northern Manhattan, to the Inwood neighborhood of New York. And people fought it, and they fought it fierce, and they won. And that's why you have now the Delaware Water Gap Natural Park.
Yeah, and you say they won, but did they really? Because there were communities that were relocated. So yes, the reservoir is not there, but there were, because I actually remember seeing condemned houses.
Yes, well, that's what I'm saying. Somewhere mid project it was stopped, and I'm saying some were relocated, especially to northern Manhattan. But it was stopped that we now have a beautiful national park. Rather than
love to hike there.
the reservoir, yeah.
Just to let you know, we were back by Stony Hill Falls today, where the aqueduct, and they are working now.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Just to give you a good note.
Good. I hope they get to Wawarsing though, because Wawarsing is pretty bad. Wawarsing is pretty bad.
One other note on capacity, after they repair the Delaware Aqueduct and reconnect the new tunnel to the Hudson, we're going to have 36 million gallons a day less leakage.
Oh.
That's what's being lost under the
Yes,
Hudson right
and
now.
I think more is actually being lost, but at least we will capture some of that. And I think they're to the point that they have no choice, because the ideas to build new reservoirs aren't viable. The Croton you can't get any more out of. Desalination is extremely expensive. So they don't really, conservation is the new reservoir, so.
Well, that might explain why they put the money into it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, think about, in the 1950s when your car got 9 miles to the gallon, you didn't care because gas was plentiful and cheap, but it's the same with water. It was just plentiful and cheap, so, yeah. Yes.
My understanding is that when they started building the reservoirs, disease was rampant in the city.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I would, is there a place to get a sense of how the disease levels shifted as these reservoirs were built?
That I don't know. That I'm sure the museum has that sort of things. I do know that if you look at the Shokan Reservoir, the Roundout Reservoir, the Neversink Reservoir, you will notice that they're lined with rock. And the reason for that is malaria was a problem. So what they would do is they would fill the reservoir to the top to let the mosquitoes land and lay eggs, and then they would drop the water suddenly so the mosquitoes would die, and that helped stop the spread of malaria. Yeah, so at least it helped with that, yes. Yeah.
Where would we go for exact information on where the aqueducts are?
If you go to the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, and sometimes you got to dig around a little bit, you will you will go down a rabbit hole, because then you'll find, each one of the departments. And again, like I said, this is like a giant corporation. You'll find, and they list the aqueducts, and they do keep extensive records, so you should be able to find them. If you can't, they're real friendly. They've been real friendly to me. Just call them up, and they'll tell you where you can find that information.
It's all around here.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if the museum has maps. They have tons of maps, so they might actually have maps. Yeah.
The town is working on that now. There's an area they've been working with the DEP. There's an area that they suspect that places have been impacted by the leakage, and it's called, I think they call it the Plan B area. If you call the town Marbletown, they can help you and show you what that, and they've actually set up an office in the town.
Oh, and that's what I mean. They keep excellent records. I guess it makes sense. Yeah.
Ulster County has a tool called the parcel viewer.
Ooh.
And if you use that,
I know.
it's on the county website. You pull it up and look at it opens up with the whole county, and you can just zoom in on any area and work with it. You can follow the reservoir property that the city owns all the way from the reservoir to the county line in Orange County.
Cool is that?
Orange County has done something else. They have a different tool, but there's no connection made.
I would suggest looking on the city website too, because like I said, there's so many different, there were departments I didn't even know existed in the DEP. And to find out all the different things they did, they actually had like a unit that keeps track of like historical, like these songbooks, like they're not even documents that have anything to do with the building of the, so I would start there.
From a historical standpoint, in New York City, Bryant Park and the New York Public Library were built on the old parts of the old Croton Reservoir. Yeah, they see that, but now the public, it just opened about 3-4 years ago, the High Bridge at about 100, yes, at about 178th and the East River, you can actually walk on parts of the old Croton Reservoir where you walk across the High Bridge on the East River, and that was part of the aqueduct of the old Croton Reservoir, and that's amazing to walk on. And then there's the water tower there, which you can now, with the Parks Department, make a reservation to walk up and see the water tower. So go on the internet at least and see the water tower, watchtower, and the High Bridge.
They are being much more cooperative with allowing people into more recreational areas. I mean, clearly 25 years ago, a lot of our recreational opportunity on reservoir lands would have been like an absolute no way are you getting on those lands. And now even just building things like that show that they're trying to be more cooperative.
And the High Bridge is an amazing hike.
It is, yeah. It's cute though.
Well, actually, now you can hike all the way from the dam, the new Croton Dam, down to the city, and they will sell you very nice maps.
Yes.
There's
I know the museum has a ton of maps.
Yes.
I mean, I didn't even put them up here, but they have all kinds of maps.
Yeah.
If you like maps. He likes maps. If you like your maps, I'm not much of a map reader. All right, thank you very much.